For my 21st birthday, my grandmother gave me a $50 million hotel. It wasn't wrapped in a bow. It was handed to me in a heavy, dark leather portfolio that smelled of history and expensive cigars, the kind my grandfather used to smoke in his study. Inside, the documents were crisp, the ink a stark, official black against the cream-colored paper. The Bennett Grand, the crown jewel of my grandmother Eleanor's empire, was now mine. My name, Annabelle Bennett, was typed in a font that looked both modern and timeless. Ownership, control, legacy. These words echoed in the quiet, opulent dining room of my grandmother's estate, where the only sounds were the gentle clinking of silverware and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I looked across the mahogany table at Eleanor. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a glint of steel that had intimidated business rivals for 50 years. But when they looked at me, they softened. "This is your inheritance, Annabelle," she said, her voice as smooth and strong as the aged wood of the table. "But it's also your test." I remember the weight of that portfolio in my hands. It felt heavier than paper and ink. It felt like the weight of expectation, of a future I had spent my life preparing for, studying architecture until the lines of blueprints blurred in my dreams. I felt a surge of pride, a deep, quiet joy that settled in my chest. For once, I felt seen, not as a responsibility, not as a financial burden, but as a successor. The peace lasted for exactly 47 minutes. That's when the doorbell chimed, a melodious but jarring sound that broke the spell. A moment later, my mother, Catherine, swept into the room, her new husband, Richard, trailing behind her like a flashy, expensive shadow. Mom was a whirlwind of expensive perfume and forced smiles. She was beautiful, in the brittle way an orchid is beautiful. Perfect to look at, but fragile and demanding constant attention. Richard was all polished shoes, a blindingly white smile, and the kind of cheap charisma that fools people who want to be fooled. He called himself a business consultant, a title as hollow as the man himself. "Annabelle, darling," Mom chirped, kissing the air beside my cheek. "We are so sorry we're late. Richard had a last-minute synergy call with Tokyo." I didn't bother to correct her that it was 7 a.m. in Tokyo. I just nodded. Richard clapped a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be familiar but felt like an invasion. "Happy birthday, kiddo! 21! Ready to take on the world?" My grandmother's eyes narrowed slightly. "Catherine, Richard, I wasn't expecting you." "Oh, Eleanor, don't be silly," Mom laughed, a sound like ice cubes rattling in an empty glass. "We wouldn't miss Annabelle's big day." Her eyes, however, weren't on me. They were locked onto the leather portfolio resting by my plate, a predator's gaze. She didn't even wait for the pretense of small talk to crumble. She glided over, her fingers tracing the embossed crest on the portfolio. "So, it's official. The Grand." She looked from me to Eleanor, her smile widening. "Well, I'm glad. It needs a firm hand, and it's time we managed it together, as a family." Richard nodded eagerly, his smile pasted on. "Absolutely. My background in global expansion will be invaluable. We'll streamline, synergize, take the Bennett brand to the next level." The air in the room grew thick and cold. I could feel the warmth of my joy just moments before turning into a knot of ice in my stomach. They spoke as if my presence was a mere formality, as if the documents in that portfolio were just a suggestion. They saw my name, but they read their own opportunity. All those years of being the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who never asked for anything while my mother burned through her allowance and then some, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of anger. I placed my hand firmly on the portfolio. "Absolutely not," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. My mother's smile froze. "What did you just say?" "I said no," I repeated, my gaze steady. "Grandma gave the hotel to me. I'm the owner now. I will be the one managing it." Richard scoffed, a little puff of air. "Now, Annabelle, let's not be naive. A $50 million asset isn't a toy for a college student. I graduate in 3 months, top of my class in architecture and design," I said, my voice dangerously low. "I know every brick, every support beam, every flaw in that building's HVAC system. What do you know about it, Richard, besides the word synergy?" My mother's face transformed. The mask of doting motherhood fell away, revealing the ugly, grasping entitlement beneath. Her eyes flashed with a fury that was all too familiar. It was the same fury I'd seen when her credit card was declined, when her social rival wore a better dress, when her own father had finally walked out on her. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed. "I am your mother. This is my house you're living in, my legacy you're spitting on." "It's Grandma's legacy," I corrected. "And this is Grandma's house. I live here because she invited me when you sent me away." The slap of truth silenced her for a second, but only a second. Then she drew herself up, her voice dripping with venom. "Then pack your bags and leave this house. See how well you manage your precious hotel when you're living on the street." The threat hung in the air, ugly and final. This was her checkmate. In her mind, she held all the cards. I was just a child playing dress-up, and she was about to put me back in my place. I felt a tremor of the old fear, the old instinct to just give in, to make peace, to buy her affection at any cost. But then I heard it, a soft, low sound from across the table. It was my grandmother. She was chuckling. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a dry, knowing sound that cut through my mother's triumphant glare. I looked at Eleanor. The steel was back in her eyes, sharp and bright. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible wink, and in that moment, I knew. The hotel wasn't the gift. It was just the opening move. My mother thought she was playing checkers, but my grandmother had just unveiled a chessboard, and the real surprise was yet to come. Thank you all for being here. Let me know what city you're watching from by dropping a comment down below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. The night was sleepless. My mother's words, "pack your bags," echoed in the silence of my bedroom, a room that had been my sanctuary for the 5 years since she'd decided my presence was an inconvenience to her new life with Richard. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the leather portfolio on my nightstand feeling less like a prize and more like a declaration of war. The old Annabelle, the one who would have cried, who would have replayed every harsh word and wondered what she did wrong, was flickering. I could feel her dying out, like a candle in a cold draft. I rose before the sun, the house still cloaked in the gray pre-dawn light. I thought I would be the only one awake, but as I padded silently down the grand staircase, I heard voices from the sunroom, low, conspiratorial murmurs. I froze on the bottom step, my hand resting on the cool, polished banister. It was them, my mother and Richard. "Completely untenable," Richard was saying, his voice a self-important drone. "She's emotional, irrational. We need to move quickly to stabilize the asset before she does any real damage." "I'll handle Eleanor," my mother replied, her voice firm. "She's sentimental, but she's not a fool. She'll see that this is the only way. Annabelle can have a title, creative consultant or something. It'll make her feel important. We'll give her a generous salary, a trust fund for her college loans. She can focus on her little drawings." A trust fund for my college loans. I was paying my way through school with scholarships and a part-time job at the campus library, a fact my mother conveniently forgot whenever she boasted about my academic achievements to her friends. A generous salary from the profits of a business that was now legally mine. The condescension was so thick I could taste it, bitter as bile. I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the foyer, and felt something inside me shift. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, clean break. The part of me that had spent a lifetime trying to earn my mother's love, the part that made excuses for her selfishness, the part that accepted the crumbs of her affection as if it were a feast, it simply broke off and floated away. The pain was still there, a dull ache behind my ribs, but it was different now. It was no longer a wound. It was fuel. It was the cold, hard realization that I had been trying to get water from a stone. My mother didn't see a daughter. She saw a competitor, an obstacle to the lifestyle she believed she was owed. Richard didn't see a stepdaughter. He saw a mark. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a hostile takeover. And in that moment, the snap happened. The tears I thought would come never did. My hands, which had been trembling, grew still. My breathing, which had been shallow, deepened into a slow, steady rhythm. The fog of hurt and confusion evaporated, and in its place was a landscape of stark, cold clarity. I stopped trying to be loved and started planning to win. Silently, I pulled out my phone. My fingers moved with a precision that surprised me. I opened the voice recorder app and pressed the red button. I held the phone, cupping it in my hand, and let it capture every single self-serving, manipulative word they said for the next 10 minutes. They talked about lawyers, they talked about petitioning for a conservatorship, claiming I was unfit. They talked about restructuring the board and firing Mr. Henderson, my grandmother's most loyal employee. They were drawing up their battle plans, and I was their silent, invisible scribe. When I had enough, I slipped back up the stairs, my movements as silent as a cat. In my room, I didn't pack a bag. I opened my laptop. I didn't cry. I created a new folder on my desktop and named it Evidence. The first file I saved was the audio I had just recorded, labeling it Sunroom_conspiracy. Then I got dressed, not in my usual jeans and sweater, but in a crisp blouse, tailored trousers, and a blazer, the armor of a businesswoman. As I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. The pleading softness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a focused, determined glint. I drove to my grandmother's estate. The morning fog was burning off, and the sun was casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. When her butler let me in, he gave me a sympathetic look, expecting to see a distraught girl. He was surprised when I gave him a firm, polite smile. Eleanor was in her study, a cup of tea steaming beside a stack of newspapers. She looked up as I entered, her expression calm and assessing. She knew I'd be here. She was waiting. She opened her mouth, probably to offer some words of comfort, but I spoke first, my voice even and clear. "I'm not here for a hug, Grandma," I said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I'm here to ask a question." She leaned back in her leather chair, a flicker of something, pride perhaps, in her stormy eyes. "Go on." "What's the plan?" The question hung in the air of the study, a room that smelled of old books and my grandmother's quiet power. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, she gestured to the chair opposite her desk. As I sat, she poured a second cup of tea, her movements precise and unhurried. The silence wasn't awkward. It was strategic. It was her way of letting the chaos of the morning settle, of letting me find my center. "The plan," she said finally, pushing the cup towards me, "began a long time ago, Annabelle, long before you were born." And as I sipped the hot, fragrant tea, the present faded away. And I was pulled back into the stories she'd told me over the years, pieces of a puzzle I was only now beginning to assemble. I saw her as a young woman, not much older than I was now, with the same stormy eyes but a fire of ambition that was all her own. She started not with an empire, but with a single, run-down motel in Vermont, bought with every penny she and my grandfather had saved. She told me how she'd worked the front desk, cleaned the rooms, and balanced the books herself, while my grandfather, a kind but impractical dreamer, handled the maintenance. The Bennett collection wasn't inherited. It was forged in hard work, sleepless nights, and shrewd risks. Every building, she used to say, tells a story. The walls remember who built them and why. Then came my mother, Catherine, her only child. Born into the success her parents had bled for, she mistook the fruits of their labor for her birthright. I remembered a photograph from my mother's youth, a beautiful, laughing girl on the deck of a yacht, champagne flute in hand. She had her mother's looks, but none of her grit. For Catherine, the business wasn't a legacy to build, it was a bank account to fund a lifestyle. She loved the prestige of being a Bennett, the attention it brought, but had no patience for the discipline it required. That's where my father, David, came in. He was the quiet ballast to my mother's frantic energy. He came from a modest background, an operations manager with a brilliant mind for logistics and a calm, steady demeanor. Eleanor saw his potential immediately and mentored him. He became the true operator of the business, the one who turned Eleanor's vision into profitable reality. He and my mother married, and for a while, it seemed like a perfect pairing, the socialite and the silent powerhouse. But I remember the cracks. My childhood was a landscape of hushed arguments behind closed doors. My mother's complaints about my father being boring and always working. My father's quiet sighs of exhaustion. He loved the work, but he was growing tired of the performance. Their marriage had become just another part of the brand, a carefully curated image of family success. The final fissure came when I was 16. I came home from school one day to find my father's closet empty. He sat me down in the living room, his face etched with a sadness so deep it seemed to age him 10 years. "Your mother and I, we want different things, Annie," he'd said. "She wants an audience. I just want a partner." He told me he couldn't live inside a lie anymore, that the love had become a performance, and he was done with the show. The divorce was swift and surprisingly quiet. My mother got a generous settlement, my father got his freedom. And me? I became an inconvenience, a living, breathing reminder of a marriage my mother wanted to erase. A week after the divorce was finalized, she announced she was engaged to Richard Miller, a man she'd met at a resort fundraiser. And a month after that, she sat me down. "Darling," she'd said, her voice dripping with false concern, "with all this change, I think you need some stability. It would be best for you to go live with your grandmother for a while." I knew then what it was. I was a witness to her past, and she was clearing the stage for her new act. Being sent to live with Eleanor wasn't a punishment for me, it was a relief. But it cemented a painful truth. My own mother saw me as disposable. Living with Eleanor was like entering a different world. She didn't treat me like a child, she treated me like an apprentice. She'd take me on site visits to her hotels, pointing out architectural flaws and operational inefficiencies. She'd spread blueprints across the dining table and teach me how to read them, how to see the building's soul within the lines. "Discipline, Annabelle," she'd say. "Risk, courage, that is the real inheritance. The buildings are just brick and mortar." My relationship with my mother dwindled to polite, infrequent phone calls. They grew shorter, colder. I'd ask about her life. She'd talk about parties, vacations, Richard's brilliant new ventures. She never asked about my classes, my friends, my life. It was as if I existed in a separate reality that she had no interest in visiting. Now, sitting in the study, all those memories clicked into place. This wasn't a new attack from my mother. It was the culmination of a lifetime of selfishness. It was a pattern. She had used her parents' money, she had used my father's talent, and now she was trying to use my future. Eleanor let the silence stretch, letting me connect the dots myself. Finally, she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "Your mother has always underestimated everyone around her," she said, her voice low and serious. "She underestimates you. She underestimates your father, and she has always underestimated me." She pointed to a framed photo on her desk, one of me and my father when I was a little girl, sitting on his shoulders. "She thinks your father just walked away. But a man like David Bennett never leaves his family unprotected." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Your mother thinks this is about a hotel. She has no idea what she's truly up against." The next morning, my grandmother's black town car picked me up. It wasn't headed for the grand, opulent entrance of the Bennett Grand, but to a discreet, unmarked office building downtown. This was the nerve center of Bennett Collection, a place my mother had likely never set foot in. The air inside was crisp and professional, the quiet hum of productivity a stark contrast to the manufactured drama of my mother's life. Eleanor was already there, seated at the head of a polished boardroom table. With her was a man I recognized instantly, Mr. Henderson, the chief operating officer of the company. He was in his 60s, with a ramrod-straight posture, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and the kind of piercingly intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had been with my grandmother for over 30 years, a loyal soldier who understood that his allegiance was to the empire, not to the whims of the flighty daughter's flighty daughter. He stood as I entered, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm and reassuring. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone respectful. "Annabelle." "Mr. Henderson," I replied, meeting his gaze. "Thank you for seeing me." "The pleasure is all mine," he said, and I knew he meant it. "I was very pleased to hear of your grandmother's decision. You are the rightful heir to this legacy." There was no flattery in his voice, only a statement of fact. It was a validation that felt more real than any diploma or good grade. He saw me not as a child, but as the future. "Annabelle has informed me," Eleanor began, getting straight to the point, "that Catherine and her husband intend to challenge the transfer of ownership." Mr. Henderson's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. "I am not surprised. Richard Miller has made 3 attempts in the last week to request full financial reports on the Grand. He was, of course, denied." My heart gave a little jolt. So their plan had been in motion even before my birthday. The dinner party wasn't an impulsive act of greed. It was a calculated ambush that had failed. He cited his relationship to Catherine, claiming he was acting on behalf of future family interests. Mr. Henderson continued, his voice laced with disdain. "I informed him that until I received a legally binding directive from you, Eleanor, or the new owner, Miss Annabelle Bennett, he had no standing whatsoever." "They're planning to file for a conservatorship," I said, the word tasting like poison. "They're going to claim I'm unstable, unfit to manage an asset of this size." For the first time, Mr. Henderson allowed a grim smile to touch his lips. "Let them try." Any judge who looks at your academic record, your focus of study, and compares it to Richard Miller's documented history of failed consulting ventures will laugh them out of court. "We have a file on him, of course." Of course they did. My grandmother left nothing to chance. "We need to be prepared," Eleanor said. "I want you to grant Annabelle full, unrestricted access to the entire corporate network, all financials, all internal communications, all security protocols for the grant. She needs to have the same level of clearance as I do." Immediately, Mr. Henderson said without hesitation. He turned to me. Annabelle, my team and I are at your disposal. We are loyal to your grandmother, and by extension, we are loyal to you. Catherine and her husband have no support within this organization. They are seen for what they are, outsiders, opportunists. The feeling of relief was immense. I wasn't fighting this battle alone. I had the quiet, formidable power of the entire Bennett Collection corporate structure behind me. There's something else, I said, pulling out my phone. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then hit play on the audio file I'd recorded. The hushed, scheming voices of my mother and Richard filled the boardroom. I watched Mr. Henderson's face as he listened. His expression hardened from professional disapproval to icy fury. He heard them plotting to oust him, to dismantle the company he had helped build, to treat it all like their personal piggy bank. When the recording finished, the silence was heavy. "Thank you for this, Annabelle," Mr. Henderson said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is not just a family matter anymore. This is a direct threat to the integrity of this company. They have declared war on us, and we will respond accordingly." Eleanor gave a curt nod of approval. "Annabelle, you will be working from here for the foreseeable future. Mr. Henderson will provide you with an office and a secure laptop. I want you to go through everything. Learn the business from the inside out. Know its strengths, its weaknesses. An architect must know the foundation before they can build." As I left the boardroom and followed Mr. Henderson to a sleek, modern office with a view of the entire city, I felt another shift inside me. The cold clarity from the day before was now mixing with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about defiance anymore. It was about competence. It was about proving them wrong, not just with words, but with action. My mother and Richard thought they were fighting a little girl for a toy. They were about to find out they were fighting a Bennett, armed with the full power of her grandmother's empire. And the battle had just begun. The next 2 days were a blur of information. I lived on coffee and sandwiches delivered to my new office, my eyes glued to the screen of the secure laptop Mr. Henderson had provided. I dove into spreadsheets, profit and loss statements, and operational reports. It was like seeing the hotel in a new dimension, not as a physical space of steel and glass, but as a living, breathing financial organism. I wasn't just an architect in training anymore. I was becoming a guardian, learning the language of the fortress I now had to defend. On the third day, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a spam call, but something made me answer. "Hello? Is this Annabelle Bennett?" The voice on the other end was a man's, raspy and tired, with an undercurrent of something that sounded like old anger. "It is. Who is this?" "My name is George Peterson," he said. "You don't know me, but I used to know your new stepfather, Richard Miller, only he called himself Rick Miller back then." I sat up straighter in my chair, my pen pausing over a column of figures. "Go on." "I owned a small chain of boutique hotels in Arizona," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "About 5 years ago, Richard, came to me as a growth consultant. He had all the buzzwords, just like I'm sure he does now. Synergy, global expansion, market disruption. He was slick, persuasive." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "What happened?" "He happened," Peterson said bitterly. "He convinced me to take out a massive business loan to fund an overseas expansion he'd masterminded. He set up shell corporations, tangled the finances in a web I couldn't even understand. He had lawyers draw up contracts that gave him enormous control. By the time I realized the expansion projects didn't exist, that the money was just being funneled into his own offshore accounts, it was too late. He drained the company dry. I lost everything. My hotels, my house, my savings. I had to declare bankruptcy. The man is a professional parasite, Miss Bennett. He finds a healthy host and bleeds it until it's dead. My hand was gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. Why are you telling me this? I saw an article online, he said. A society piece about your mother's recent wedding. I saw his picture and the blood in my veins ran cold. And then I saw the name, Bennett. I know your grandmother's company. It's a titan. It's the biggest host he's ever tried to latch onto. He ruined my life, and I couldn't prove a thing. His paperwork was too good, too convoluted. But he's getting arrogant. He's getting sloppy. I have documents, old emails, records of wire transfers. They might not have been enough to put him away back then, but they establish a pattern of fraud. If you're going up against him, maybe they can help you. Mr. Peterson, I said, my voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Yes, anything you have would be invaluable. After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence. This wasn't just about greed anymore. Richard wasn't just an opportunistic leech. He was a predator who left a trail of ruined lives in his wake. He wasn't trying to take my hotel. He was trying to destroy my family's legacy for a quick payday before disappearing, just as he had done to Mr. Peterson. This was his modus operandi. I immediately emailed him from a secure account, and within the hour, a file containing scanned documents and email chains landed in my inbox. Another folder, labeled Peterson_evidence, was added to my collection. The rage I felt gave me a strange, sharp focus, but the day held one more wound for me. Later that evening, feeling overwhelmed, I logged into my personal email looking for a distraction. I saw an email chain from my cousin, Leo. Leo was a few years older than me, always the fun cousin, the one who seemed to be on my side during family gatherings, rolling his eyes in solidarity when my mother would start her dramatic monologues. The subject line was, "Checking in." His email was full of feigned concern. "Hey, Annie, heard about the drama with Aunt Catherine. So crazy. Are you holding up okay? Let me know if you need anything at all. I'm on your side, 100%. It was a small comfort, a reminder that not everyone in my family was against me. Feeling a bit of warmth, I scrolled down, meaning to reply. But my eyes caught the thread of the conversation below his message. He had, carelessly, replied to the whole chain instead of starting a new message. And there, below his signature, was his previous email. An email he had sent to my mother. My blood turned to ice as I read it. "Aunt Catherine," it began, "just spoke with Annie. She's definitely digging in her heels. She seems to be working out of some corporate office downtown. Sounds like Eleanor has her hunkered down. She sounds stressed but is trying to act tough. I'll keep trying to get more information on what their strategy is. Keep me in the loop on the lawyer front. Don't worry, we'll get this sorted. Your loving nephew, Leo." I had to read it 3 times before the words fully registered. The friendly check-in, the offer of support, it was all a lie. He was a spy. My own cousin, the one I thought was my ally, was feeding information directly to the enemy, likely in exchange for some promised slice of the pie once they took over. The sense of betrayal was suffocating, far more personal and painful than what my mother had done. Her selfishness was a known quantity. This was a knife in the back from someone I'd trusted. I felt a wave of nausea. I leaned back in my chair, the sleek corporate office suddenly feeling like a cold, lonely prison. I clicked forward on the email from Leo to my personal lawyer and added it to my evidence folder. The name of the file was simple: betrayal. My collection of receipts was growing, each one purchased at a higher and higher emotional cost. I was winning the battle for the hotel, but I felt like I was losing my family, piece by painful piece. The revelation of Leo's betrayal left a scar. It was a harsh lesson in the corrosive power of greed, how it could turn a person you thought you knew into a stranger, an informant. I didn't tell my grandmother about it immediately. I held that particular pain close, letting it fuel my resolve. I spent the next day buried even deeper in work, my interactions with Mr. Henderson and his team becoming more fluid, more confident. I was learning. I was adapting. I was becoming the person I needed to be to survive this. That evening, Eleanor summoned me to her estate. She didn't want to meet in the study or the formal living room. Instead, she led me down a quiet, wood-paneled hallway to a room I had rarely entered, my grandfather's old library. It had been kept exactly as he'd left it years ago, filled with the scent of leather-bound books, pipe tobacco, and time itself. "There is something your father left for you," she said, her voice soft in the still air. "He gave it to me the day he left. He knew, I think, that a day like this would come." She walked over to a large, ornate globe in the corner of the room. With a quiet click, she released a hidden latch, and a section of the bookshelf behind it swung inward, revealing a small, dark wall safe. My eyes widened. I had never known it was there. She spun the combination dial with practiced ease, the tumblers falling into place with a series of satisfying clicks. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside, there weren't jewels or stacks of cash. There was just a single, small, unassuming book. It was a simple black ledger, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. She took it out and handed it to me. It felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. "Your father was a meticulous man," Eleanor said, her gaze distant, lost in memory. "He saw things. He noticed discrepancies long before I did. I was too close to it, I suppose, too willing to believe that my daughter's extravagances were just youthful folly." I opened the ledger. On the first page, in my father's neat, precise handwriting, was a date from 15 years ago. The entry was simple: $5,000 withdrawal from Burlington account. Reason given: caterer deposit for charity gala. Actual use: Chanel handbag, personal purchase. I flipped the page, and another, and another. The book was a secret history of my mother's deceit. It was a detailed, dated, and documented record of every time she had skimmed from the company accounts when she thought no one was looking. There were small amounts and large amounts. Money for business lunches that were actually spa days with her friends. Funds for office renovations that became a new designer wardrobe. A down payment for a company car that turned out to be a sports car for her then-boyfriend. Each entry was backed up with a reference number to a bank statement or a receipt my father had quietly saved. It was irrefutable. It was devastating. And it painted a picture of my mother not as a misguided woman, but as a habitual thief, a person who had been stealing from her own family for decades. "The day he told me he was leaving her," Eleanor continued, her voice barely a whisper, "he was heartbroken, not just because the marriage was over, but because he knew what she was. He gave me this ledger. I remember his exact words. He said, 'Eleanor, I can't protect Annabelle from her mother's nature forever, but one day she might need this to protect herself. He made me promise to keep it safe until the day came when you were old enough and strong enough to use it.'" I sank into one of the leather armchairs, the ledger open on my lap. This wasn't just evidence. This was a message from my father across the years. It was his quiet way of saying, "I see you. I know what you're up against. I'm still on your side." He hadn't just walked away from the chaos, he had left behind a weapon for me, a shield forged from his own pain and foresight. He knew a divorce settlement wouldn't stop her. He knew her appetite was insatiable. The weight in my hands was no longer just a book. It was the weight of my father's love, his silent protection. He had seen the pattern long ago, the same pattern that was repeating itself now, only on a much grander scale. She hadn't changed. She had only gotten bolder, with Richard as her willing accomplice. She always believed she was smarter than everyone else, Eleanor said, watching my face. She thought your father was just a boring bookkeeper. She never realized that his quietness was not weakness, but observation. He saw every lie, every theft, and he wrote it all down. I carefully closed the ledger. This was the ace up my sleeve. This was the receipt that could burn their entire plan to the ground. My mother was about to find out that the man she had dismissed and the daughter she had abandoned were far more formidable than she had ever imagined. He was right, I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name, a mixture of grief for the father I missed and immense gratitude for the man he was. I am strong enough now. I placed the ledger into my briefcase, alongside the audio recording, the evidence from Mr. Peterson, and the printout of Leo's betrayal. My arsenal was complete. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to make the next move, and I knew it wouldn't be long. The next move came 2 days later, delivered by a courier to my grandmother's front door. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the letterhead of a high-priced law firm in the city, Davies, Finch and Associates. My name was on the front, spelled out in an imposing, formal font. My hands were perfectly steady as I opened it. The arrogance of the act was breathtaking. They weren't just threatening a legal battle. They were reveling in it. They were so certain of their position, so confident in my perceived weakness, that they felt the need to formalize their attack with the weight of a powerful law firm. They believed this would be the blow that would make me crumble. The letter was a masterpiece of condescending legalese. It was a formal petition to the court, a request for a temporary emergency conservatorship over my assets, namely the Bennett Grand. It was filled with carefully worded accusations, each one a poisoned dart. It cited my tender age and lack of real-world business experience. It mentioned my emotional state, alluding to the stress of a recent and significant inheritance. It even had the audacity to suggest that my refusal to collaborate with my loving mother was evidence of my unstable judgment and susceptibility to undue influence from my grandmother. The chief argument was that I was a danger to the stability of the asset, that my rash decisions could jeopardize the jobs of hundreds of employees and tarnish the Bennett name. It was signed by my mother, Catherine Bennett, and her husband, Richard Miller, who was listed as a concerned party with significant business acumen. It was signed by my mother, detailing her deep concern for my well-being. It painted a picture of me as a fragile, overwhelmed girl, easily manipulated and not in her right mind. It was a work of fiction so complete, so divorced from reality, it was almost impressive. The other affidavit was from Richard. It was a self-aggrandizing summary of his vast experience in turning businesses around, filled with the usual empty jargon about synergy and optimization. He positioned himself as the steady, expert hand needed to guide the hotel through this turbulent transition. I read the entire package, all 12 pages of it, without a flicker of emotion on my face. The old me would have been devastated, wounded by the clinical, cruel way my own mother was trying to paint me as mentally incompetent for financial gain. But the new me, the one forged in the cold fire of the last week, felt nothing but a profound, icy calm. This wasn't an attack. It was a gift. It was the ultimate act of hubris. Fueled by the scraps of information from my cousin Leo, they had completely misjudged their opponent. They thought they were cornering a frightened mouse, but they were prodding a hibernating bear. This document wasn't a weapon against me. It was their entire battle plan, laid out in black and white. It was every lie, every angle of attack, every false narrative they planned to use, all neatly packaged and delivered to my doorstep. I picked up my phone and called my grandmother, who was at the corporate office. "It's here," I said, my voice even. "The letter from Mr. Davies, I presume?" she replied, her own voice unbothered. "The same. It's exactly what we expected. They're petitioning for conservativeship." "Arrogant fools," she murmured. "They've put their entire strategy in writing and handed it to us. They believe they've backed us into a corner that we'll be forced to negotiate. They want us to be scared of a court battle, of the publicity," I said, looking at the letter with something akin to pity. "They think we'll give them what they want to make it go away." "And what do you want to do, Annabelle?" she asked, a test in her voice. I looked out the window at the clear blue sky. I felt a sense of absolute certainty settle over me. "I want to let them think they've won," I said. "I want them to walk into the final confrontation brimming with confidence. I want them to believe, right up until the very last second, that they are in complete control." A slow smile spread across my face. "And then," I continued, "I want to take everything from them." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard my grandmother's low, satisfied chuckle once again. "That's my granddaughter," she said. "It's time to set the stage for the final act." The counter-move was not a letter from our own high-powered lawyers. It was not a furious phone call. It was something far more subtle and therefore far more disarming, an act of apparent surrender. The next afternoon, my grandmother herself made the call to my mother. I was in her study with her, listening on speakerphone, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of anticipation. "Catherine," Eleanor said, her voice carefully modulated to sound weary, old, and defeated. "I received a copy of the letter from your lawyers." She sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of breath. I am too old for this fight, for court battles and public spectacles." On the other end, there was a moment of surprised silence. My mother had expected resistance, anger, threats. She was not prepared for capitulation. "Well, Eleanor," she finally said, her voice unable to hide a note of triumphant glee, "I'm glad you're seeing reason. Richard and I are only doing what's best for the family and for the business." "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded, the word tasting like victory to me. "Perhaps you are right. Annabelle is young. This is too much for her to handle alone." I could almost see my mother preening on the other end of the line, exchanging a smug look with Richard. They were taking the bait, hook, line, and sinker. "This entire affair has been distasteful," Eleanor continued, her voice heavy with feigned regret. "A family like ours should not be airing its laundry in a courtroom. It is undignified." "Exactly," my mother agreed eagerly. "That's all we've been saying." "So, I would like to propose a solution," my grandmother said. "Before we proceed with any more legal filings, let's have a civilized dinner, here, at the house, tonight. You, Richard, and your lawyer, Mr. Davies. Annabelle and I will be here. We will discuss the terms of a proper transition, one that protects Annabelle's interests while acknowledging your experience." The trap was set. It was a beautiful, elegant trap, appealing directly to their vanity and their greed. An invitation to come and dictate the terms of their surrender. It offered them everything they wanted: control, a sense of victory, and the chance to avoid a costly legal fight they were only threatening because they thought we'd be intimidated. "A dinner?" my mother said, suspicion momentarily warring with her avarice. "Why?" "Because," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a confidential, almost pleading tone, "I want this to be over. I want peace in my family, and I want to do this face to face, not through letters and threats. Let's be a family again, Catherine. Let's find a way forward, together." The word family was the masterstroke. It was the word my mother always used to justify her own selfish desires. To hear it from my grandmother, in a tone of defeat, was irresistible to her. "Very well," she said, her voice now dripping with magnanimity, as if she were granting a great favor. "We will be there, 8 o'clock. "Wonderful," Eleanor said, her voice sounding frail. "We'll see you then." She hung up the phone. The frail, defeated old woman vanished. The steel returned to her eyes, sharp and lethal. She looked at me. "The guests have accepted our invitation," she said, a grim smile playing on her lips. "Now we prepare the feast." The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of quiet, precise preparation. We didn't call a caterer. We called our lawyer, a shrewd, silver-haired woman named Miss Albright, who had been the Bennett family's legal counsel for 40 years. We didn't discuss a menu. We reviewed the evidence, arranging it in a neat, chronological file. The audio recording, Mr. Peterson's damning file on Richard, Leo's treacherous email, and the crown jewel, my father's ledger. Mrs. Albright was a woman of few words, but her eyes lit up with a predatory gleam as she reviewed the ledger. "This is an executioner's blade, Eleanor," she murmured, her respect for my father evident. Finally, one last call was made, this one by Eleanor herself, to an old friend of my late grandfather's, a man who happened to be the chief of police. It was a brief, quiet conversation. She did not make a request. She simply gave him a notification. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the lawn, the stage was set. The dining room table was laid with the finest china and silver, not for a meal, but for a judgment. Every piece of evidence was copied onto a thumb drive, which Miss Albright discreetly placed beside her plate. I felt a strange calm descend upon me. There was no fear, no anger, no sadness. There was only the quiet, thrumming certainty of the coming storm. They were walking into the lion's den, believing they were the hunters. They had no idea they were the prey. At precisely 8 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. They were punctual, a testament to how eager they were for their coronation. I stood beside my grandmother in the grand foyer as the butler opened the door. My mother, Catherine, swept in first, dressed in a sharp crimson dress that screamed power and victory. Richard was beside her, his suit immaculate, his smile a predatory slash of white. And behind them was Mr. Davies, their lawyer, a portly man carrying a pristine leather briefcase that practically radiated smugness. They looked less like dinner guests and more like a conquering army. "Eleanor, Annabelle," my mother said, her tone syrupy sweet, "thank you for being so reasonable about this." "Let's hope we can find an amicable path forward," Mr. Davies boomed, shaking my grandmother's hand with a little too much force. He gave me a dismissive nod, the kind one gives to a child who is being allowed to sit at the adults' table. We led them into the dining room. The table was set, but no food was present, only crystal glasses of water, a silent statement that this was not a social call. Miss Albright, our lawyer, was already seated, her presence a quiet, immovable rock. Her nod to Mr. Davies was curt, professional, and utterly unimpressed. They took their seats, my mother and Richard beaming, their lawyer arranging his briefcase on the floor beside him. They thought this was their victory lap. "Well," Mr. Davies began, taking charge immediately. "As we are all here to be efficient, let's get to the heart of the matter. My clients are prepared to be very generous. They propose a structure wherein a new management board is created for the Bennett Grand. Richard, given his expertise, will serve as chairman. Catherine, as the family figurehead, will have a seat as well." He slid a piece of paper across the table. "They propose that Annabelle be given the honorary title of Founder's Legacy Chair. She will have no executive authority, of course, but she will be granted a very substantial annual salary. All college debts will be settled, and a trust will be established for her future needs. It's a very handsome offer, designed to ensure her financial security without burdening her with responsibilities for which she is, frankly, unequipped." The condescendence was so profound it was almost comical. They were offering me an allowance to step aside from my own company. I glanced at my grandmother. Her face was a mask of placid neutrality. "We believe this is the best path forward to protect the asset and ensure a smooth professional operation," Richard added, leaning forward earnestly, as if sharing a great secret. "It's about synergy, combining Annabelle's connection to the legacy with our practical, real-world experience." My mother nodded, a look of faux sincere concern on her face. "We just want what's best for you, darling, and for the family name." They finished their presentation and sat back, their expressions expectant. They believed they had laid down the law, that all that was left was for us to sign their terms of surrender. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then I cleared my throat. All eyes turned to me. I reached into the simple folder in front of me and pulled out a small, digital voice recorder. I pressed play. My mother's voice, hushed and conspiratorial, filled the silent room. "Annabelle can have a title, creative consultant or something. It'll make her feel important. We'll give her a generous salary." Then Richard's voice, "We need to move quickly to stabilize the asset before she does any real damage." The color drained from my mother's face. Richard's smile twitched and vanished. Mr. Davies's jaw went slack. They stare at the small black device on the table as if it were a venomous snake. "That's just a conversation taken out of context," my mother stammered, her voice suddenly shrill. "Is it?" I asked calmly. I pushed the recorder aside and slid a single sheet of paper across the table towards Mr. Davies. Perhaps this provides more context. It was a printout of the email from my cousin, Leo, the one where he reported my movements and state of mind back to my mother. She sounds stressed but is trying to act tough. Keep me in the loop on the lawyer front. Mr. Davies read it, his eyes widening. He looked at my mother, a flicker of professional alarm in his expression. This was no longer a simple competency hearing. This was evidence of conspiracy. "Now," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "let's talk about Mr. Miller's practical, real-world experience." I gestured to Miss Albright. She coolly opened her laptop, turned the screen towards them, and began a slideshow. The first slide was a picture of Richard. The next was a series of documents, bank statements, wire transfers, and sworn affidavits from a man named George Peterson detailing how Richard had systematically bankrupted his hotel chain in Arizona under the guise of consulting. Richard turned a pasty, sickly white. This is slander. These are fabricated lies. Are they? Ms. Albright said, her voice cutting like ice. Because we have a forensic accountant who will testify under oath that the wire transfer patterns are identical to the shell corporations you began setting up 2 weeks before Annabelle's birthday. My mother stared at Richard, a look of dawning horror on her face. She had hitched her wagon to a con man, and he had led her straight off a cliff. But her nightmare was only just beginning. But this isn't really about Richard, I said, my gaze locking onto my mother's. He's just a symptom. The disease, the entitlement, that's been around for much longer. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the final piece of evidence, the small, black ledger. I opened it and placed it on the table in front of her. She stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. Then her eyes focused on the first page, on the familiar, neat handwriting, my father's handwriting. I watched her read the first entry, and the second, and the third. I saw the blood drain from her face until her skin was the color of chalk. I saw her hand begin to tremble. This wasn't an anonymous business document. This was her life of secret sins, cataloged by the man she had called boring and predictable. This, she whispered, her voice a strangled rasp. Where did you get this? Dad left it for me, I said quietly. He knew what you were. He knew you'd never stop. Mr. Davies, the smug lawyer, looked like he had been punched in the stomach. His case, his entire strategy, had just been systematically dismantled and immolated before his eyes. His clients weren't concerned family members. They were a conspirator, a fraudster, and a habitual embezzler. My mother stared at the ledger, then looked up at me, her eyes wild with a mixture of hatred and utter panic. The mask was gone. The polished society matron was gone. All that was left was a cornered thief. This is my legacy. My life! My mother shrieked, her voice cracking, her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. She slammed her hand on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. That hotel is mine by right. You can't just hand it to her, a child, after everything I've done for this family. The sheer, unadulterated gall of that statement hung in the air. Done for this family? She had leached off this family, used it, and was actively trying to defraud it. Mr. Davies was trying to signal her to be quiet, his face pale with professional terror, but she was beyond reason. She was a cornered animal, lashing out. Richard was silent, a statue of impotent rage and fear. His career as a parasite was over, and he knew it. The evidence was too complete, too damning. My grandmother, who had been silent throughout my entire presentation, finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it commanded the absolute attention of the room. You are right about one thing, Catherine, she said, her stormy eyes fixed on her daughter. The Bennett Grand is your legacy. My mother stared at her, confused, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Yes, it is. So you see? It is the legacy of your greed, Eleanor continued, her voice cold as a tombstone. It is the monument to your entitlement. It is the final, definitive proof of your character. A slow, chilling smile spread across my grandmother's face. It was the smile of a chess master who had seen the board 20 moves ahead. You see, she said, leaning forward slightly, you've been so focused on the prize, you never once thought to question the nature of the game. You thought this was about a $50 million hotel. She paused, letting the silence stretch. letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. "The hotel," she said, her voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "was the bait." The air went out of the room. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Richard looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Even Miss Albright, who knew what was coming, looked on with grim satisfaction. "You poor, foolish children," Eleanor said, shaking her head with something that looked almost like pity. "Did you really think I would build a $500 million empire and leave its fate to a single vulnerable asset transfer on a 21st birthday? Did you really think I was that sentimental, that stupid?" She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out into the dark, manicured gardens. The entire Bennett collection, every hotel, every property, every share of stock, every liquid asset was placed into an irrevocable trust over a decade ago, a trust with a single, very specific, and very unusual clause. She turned back to face them, her silhouette framed against the dark glass. She was no longer just a grandmother or a businesswoman. She was a queen in her throne room, passing judgment. The clause is called the Legacy Defense Protocol. The trust designated Annabelle as the sole beneficiary, but her full control was contingent. It would only be unlocked, fully and irrevocably transferred to her when she successfully defended the Bennett legacy against a significant internal threat. The trust required her to prove not just that she was smart enough to run the business, but that she was strong enough to protect it from predators, from parasites, from family. Her gaze settled on my mother, and there was no warmth, no love, only the cold, hard finality of justice. Your legal action, your conspiracy with Richard, your attempt to declare my granddaughter incompetent, that was the threat. The official, documented threat the trust required. She walked back to the table and placed her hands flat upon its polished surface. The Bennett Grand wasn't an inheritance, Catherine. It was a test. It was the piece of cheese in the mousetrap. I gave Annabelle the ammunition, the knowledge, the education, the allies. But she had to be the one to see the threat, to gather the evidence, and to pull the trigger. She had to prove she was worthy of the power she was about to inherit. She looked over at me, and for the first time that night, her eyes softened with a deep, boundless pride that made my heart ache. "And she passed," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with finality, with flying colors. She turned to Miss Albright. "You may proceed." Miss Albright nodded, pulling a final document from her briefcase. "As of 8:45 p.m. this evening, upon my signature as trustee and witness to these events, the Legacy Defense Protocol has been satisfied. All assets of the Bennett Trust, valued at approximately $500 million, are now under the sole and exclusive control of Annabelle Bennett. Any and all claims by Catherine Bennett or any other party are hereby null and void." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother didn't scream, she didn't rage, she just collapsed back into her chair, a single choked sob escaping her lips. The sound was not one of sadness, but of utter, soul-crushing defeat. She hadn't just lost a hotel, she had lost everything. She had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and she had personally handed her daughter the keys to the entire kingdom through her own blind, predictable greed. The game was over. Checkmate. Just as the finality of my grandmother's revelation settled over the room like a shroud, a new sound pierced the heavy silence. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, followed by the soft, professional slam of car doors, then the calm, authoritative chime of the doorbell. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide with animal panic. He looked towards the door, then back at the evidence spread across the table, his mind clearly racing for an escape route where there was none. My mother remained slumped in her chair, a broken statue of her former self. Mr. Davies, the lawyer, was slowly, methodically packing his briefcase, his face a mask of grim resignation. He knew his role in this drama was over. Now all he could do was manage the fallout for himself. The butler opened the front door, and two men in dark suits stepped into the foyer, followed by a woman in a detective's badge. I recognized her instantly. It was Detective Miller, a woman with intelligent, no-nonsense eyes and a reputation for being unshakably thorough. She was the friend my grandmother had called. She paused at the entrance to the dining room, her gaze sweeping over the scene with a practiced eye. She saw the henpecked lawyer, the defeated woman, the panicked con man, and the two calm, composed women at the head of the table. She nodded slightly at my grandmother. "Eleanor," she said, her voice polite but firm, "you said there might be a situation here that required our attention." "Detective Miller, thank you for coming," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "Indeed, we have been the targets of a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud." She gestured towards Richard. "This man, Richard Miller, has a history of defrauding businesses, a fact supported by evidence we have already collected." She then gestured towards my mother. "And my daughter, Catherine Bennett, has been his active accomplice in an attempt to illegally seize control of private assets through fraudulent legal claims and embezzlement, a pattern of behavior documented over the last 15 years. The detective's eyes flickered towards the black ledger still sitting on the table in front of my mother. "That's a very serious accusation," Detective Miller said, though her tone suggested she already believed every word. "One we are fully prepared to back up in court," Miss Albright interjected, vising from her seat. "We have recordings, sworn statements from other victims, email records, and forensic accounting. They came here tonight to coerce a young woman into signing over her property under threat of a fraudulent conservatorship. I'd say that's more than just a family squabble." Detective Miller nodded. She looked at Richard. "Mr. Miller, I'd like you to come with us. We have some questions for you regarding your business dealings, both here and in the state of Arizona." Two uniformed officers stepped forward. Richard shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is a family misunderstanding. You have no right." "We can discuss your rights downtown," the detective said, her voice devoid of patience. As the officers moved to flank him, Richard's bluster evaporated, replaced by a desperate, pleading look towards my mother. "Catherine, do something!" My mother didn't even look at him. She just stared blankly at the wood grain of the table. She had nothing left to give, nothing left to say. She had played her hand and lost in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. As the officers calmly handcuffed Richard and led him away, his protests dissolving into pathetic whimpers, Detective Miller turned her attention to my mother. "Mrs. Miller," she said, using the new name like a final twist of the knife, "we will also need you to come in for questioning." Slowly, as if moving through water, my mother rose. She didn't protest, she didn't cry. All the fight had gone out of her. As a female officer gently guided her out of the room, she passed by me, her eyes empty and vacant. She didn't look at me, the daughter she had tried to disown and declare mentally unfit. In her eyes, I probably didn't even exist anymore. I was just the architect of her ruin. The room was suddenly, blessedly quiet. All that was left was me, my grandmother, and our lawyer. The ugly, grasping energy was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered, precisely and irrevocably. The house, which had felt like a battleground, once again felt like a home. Thank you for staying with me through all of that. You are truly a wonderful and patient audience. If you've been on this journey with me up to this point, please do me a huge favor and like this video and comment with the number 1 down below. It lets me know you're still here, and your support is a tremendous encouragement for me to keep sharing these stories. Just type the number 1 and then listen as I tell you how it all ended. In the weeks that followed the dinner party that wasn't, the fallout was swift and decisive. Richard Miller, faced with the mountain of evidence from us and the reopened case from Arizona, posted bail and promptly vanished. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and he became a fugitive, a ghost haunting the edges of the life he had tried to infiltrate. My mother, stripped of Richard's influence and her own delusions, was a different story. She was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and several counts of embezzlement based on the irrefutable evidence in my father's ledger. Faced with the prospect of a lengthy, humiliating public trial, she accepted a plea deal. She received 5 years of probation, was forced to pay significant restitution to the company she had stolen from for years, and had to perform 2,000 hours of community service. But the legal consequences were nothing compared to the social and personal ones. Her name was ruined. Her friends, the ones who had flocked to her for her money and status, abandoned her overnight. She had to sell her lavish apartment to pay her legal fees and moved into a small rented condo. She had lost everything she valued: her money, her position, her pride. She had flown too close to the sun on wings of greed, and they had melted, sending her crashing back to an earth she no longer recognized. I heard from our lawyers that she never mentioned my name. In her mind, she had been robbed, the victim of a grand conspiracy. Forgiveness, my grandmother once told me, is for people who can admit what they've done. My mother couldn't. My cousin Leo was dealt with more quietly. My grandmother called his parents, my aunt and uncle, and calmly laid out the evidence of his betrayal. There was no shouting, no drama, just the cold, hard facts. He was disowned from the family's business interests and, more painfully for him, cut off from the family trust he had been banking on his entire life. His short-sighted treachery had cost him his future. A month after that fateful dinner, another visitor came to my grandmother's house. My father, David. He flew in from California, looking older, his hair grayer, but his eyes were the same, calm, kind, and intelligent. He didn't say much at first. He just gave me a long, tight hug that said everything. Later, he and I sat with my grandmother in her study. He looked at Eleanor, his expression full of a deep, quiet respect. "You did the right thing, Eleanor," he said, "for Annabelle, for the company. You did what I never could." "You did your part, David," she replied softly, gesturing to the safe where the ledger had once been kept. "You left her the sword. She just had to learn how to wield it." He turned to me then, a proud, sad smile on his face. "Your mother and I, we built our lives on different foundations. She built hers on sand. You, Annie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you're building yours on solid rock, just like your grandmother." That spring, I graduated from college at the top of my class, just as I had promised myself I would. The day I received my diploma felt like the true closing of a chapter. The inheritance wasn't just about money or buildings anymore. It was about earning my place, not just being given it. On my first official day as the CEO of the Bennett Collection, I didn't go to a board meeting. I went with my grandmother to the rooftop of the Bennett Grand, the hotel that had started it all. The city spread out before us, a breathtaking panorama of glass and steel sparkling in the afternoon sun. We stood there for a long time, not speaking, just sharing the moment. Eleanor raised an imaginary glass in a toast. "To new foundations," she said, her voice carrying on the wind. "To new foundations," I echoed, my own voice firm and clear. I looked out at the skyline. at the endless possibilities stretching to the horizon. I realized then that the greatest inheritance my grandmother had given me wasn't the $50 million hotel or even the $500 million empire. It was the freedom that came with it. The freedom from my mother's manipulations, the freedom from my own self-doubt, the freedom to design and build my own life on my own terms. The hotel was just brick and mortar. The real legacy was the strength I had found within myself to protect it, and that was a foundation that no one could ever take away. Thank you so much for listening to my entire story. I truly appreciate you being here with me. Please comment with the letter A so I know you made it all the way to the end, that you're different from all the rest. If you have any feelings or thoughts about what happened, I'd love to read them. And please continue to click on the other videos on this channel to enjoy more of our stories.